Gravity. What is gravity? I believe it to be the biggest elephant in the room. Well, there are many, actually, completely crazy notions in modern physics, but this, in my view, is one of the biggest ones. This is the biggest elephant in the room of physics, and I cannot for the life of me think why it's been missed. There are many more, as we will see. Why? I believe we can divide physics into two halves. One, Newtonian physics, or what I would call natural philosophy, where the person uses their senses, they look at nature, they look at the universe, and then try to explain what they see as happening. In other words, they look at reality and explain reality. On the other side, you have quantum physics, where a bunch of mathematicians, I wouldn't call these people natural philosophers, because for them nature or reality means nothing. For them mathematics means everything, and whatever mathematical equations regurgitate, they seem to think it must be the truth. In other words, they believe mathematics to be a God-given thing, the engine of perfect truth, not an invention by the human mind, which in itself is absolute madness. So if I said to you, there are lots of problems in physics, where do you think the great majority lies? Do they lie here, where we've seen the universe with our own eyes and explained it, or here where we just close our eyes and hope for the best? I think you'll agree with me that it has to be here. What do the mathematicians say about gravity? I say mathematicians because, for reasons I just explained, I do not think they're natural philosophers. They, in fact, have absolutely no idea of what gravity is or where it comes from. In fact, because they love particles and discovering new things, they've even invented garbage like gravitons, because if you invent it and some other idiot finds it, then you get a Nobel Prize. And so there's an enormous amount of draw towards coming up with mad ideas, because being simple and straightforward gets you nothing. So a physicist, or a real physicist, observes reality and tries to explain it, and a mathematician extrapolates from assumptions regardless of reality, meaning that if you calculate the perfect wingspan for a pig, that makes it real. In other words, flying pigs must exist, and that of course is not true. And this is the source of all of the magic and mystery. If you've followed the first videos, hopefully you've seen just a little bit. If you bear with me, all of these notions are cumulative. I can't put them all in one video, so as you keep looking at them, more and more aspects of this madness will come about. There's a lot wrong with human mathematics. I believe it to be entirely man-made, and therefore it serves our survival, and there's a separate video where I will try and explain to you what I see, and hopefully you may or may not agree. What does Newton say about gravity? This is Newton's equation for mass 1, mass 2. You can forget the whole thing because we're not interested in mathematics. Here we're interested in visual physics to actually understand what's happening. So in essence, what is this equation about? This equation says one thing and one thing only, and very firmly, and is very clear about it: mass. Mass is the cause of gravity. And mass, as we know, are protons and neutrons. There may be, for the time being, you can accept what the physicists believe, the mass of the electrons. The electron does not have a mass. The electron is a photon. We'll see that in a separate video, but for now we can accept it if you want. But predominantly mass comes from this, and the physicists believe this to be an absolute entity, like a bag of potatoes or a lump of coal. That is not true, as you'll see in a minute. So the essence of mass, for now, as I said, let's stick to the definition of the physics, that mass are protons and neutrons, because remember, neutrons are modified protons. This definition is limited and partial. It is not the right definition, and when you see the particle zoo under the video, you'll hopefully see what I mean. Newton's argument is simple. Newton, and I use this deliberately, hopefully partially to entertain you, but also it is actually that simple, and I don't know how you could miss it. Newton's argument is this, and I will use the muddy dog logic to explain it to you. Imagine you have a smell, a wet, dirty, doggy smell. This smell is always there when the dog is there. It is never there when the dog is not there. The bigger the dog, the bigger the smell. The smaller the dog, the smaller the smell. The closer the dog is to you, the bigger the smell. And the further away the dog is, the smaller the smell. If I ask you the question, what is the source of this smell? What would you say? Well, Isaac Newton's very clear about this. It says it's the bloody dog. Obviously, it has to be the dog. So, according to Isaac Newton, gravity is an innate feature of atoms. He had no idea what atom was at that time, but his insight is frightening. So, yes, it's part of that. So if it's not something special or external, as far as Newton is concerned, it's something to do with the atoms themselves. So how? The very first step of reactions in the universe, we've seen this already and I'll go through them again, is the formation of the hydrogen atom. One electron and one proton. The gravitational congregation of hydrogen atoms to form hydrogen nebulae and hydrogen stars. That also nobody would argue. And the fusion of hydrogen atoms to form neutrons and photons, because they're manufactured from the process of electrons and protons and the other atoms, atomic speciation, which I've discussed. So therefore, as we also have seen, all atoms are rearrangements of hydrogen atoms. That is all they are. Here's an hydrogen atom, protons, electrons, protons, electrons, protons, electrons. Okay, neutrons of course, but remember, neutrons are just modified protons. So as you keep going bigger and bigger, atoms are nothing again than protons, electrons, congregations of hydrogen atoms, different spatial arrangements. And since all rocks are made up of atoms, the rock is just a bigger hydrogen atom, so is the moon, so is the sun, and so is the galaxy. Why would you expect it to be anything else? Why hydrogen molecule? This actually is one of the first irrational interpretations of like charges. I've already discussed this in a previous video, because it doesn't make any sense. Like charges do not repel one another. If they did, the hydrogen molecule would not be the preferential state of the hydrogen gas. Basically what happens is the protons are still hungry in the hydrogen atom, and they try to grab each other's electrons. Since they both have equal strength, they end up lockjawed, like two hyenas biting each other. The molecule is the preferred state, and the double repulsion is nonsense, and that's a big elephant in the room of physics. So why does gravity squash? Imagine, just take a moment and imagine that you're a trapeze artist hanging from the ceiling in a circus by a rope. There's another one. You grab each other and try to pull. What happens? You squash into one another violently, and both of the pulling forces are now squashing forces because of the way it's arranged. Now, this is what happens to hydrogen atoms in space, and it doesn't really matter where there are trillions of hydrogen atoms. Every time they keep combining, because they should keep combining. Why wouldn't they? What changes when two hydrogen atoms combine when they're hungry? Nothing. The ratios of electrons to protons remains the same, and therefore the hunger of the cluster continues exactly in the same way that the hydrogen atom itself is hungry. So it keeps congregating around this. The very first lump becomes the stationary point, or the anchor, or the center of gravity for later purposes, and every other hydrogen atom that is congregated will combine exactly in the same way, keep squashing, and what we have essentially is what I call lattice pressure. The whole of the congregation increases, and all of the pull forces, weirdly enough, translate into a push force because of what we just saw. And this is cumulative, and it's the highest at the center point of gravity, or the anchor itself, and it diminishes as it goes outwards, which is what we expect from the force of gravity. All the force vectors are additive. What I mean by that is that if you take a single proton and you add them all together, like the congregation of hydrogen atoms, you get a bigger cluster of protons, and all of those are now added. The cluster vector of added. You just get a bigger hydrogen molecule, obviously. And this is the relative sizes of different things, like the rock, the moon, etc. So, just to explain that in slightly other way, now let me show you. If this is showing you the force field of a proton at the center, and it diminishes as it goes out, and then it stops completely. There is the center as the proton, and in one of these, say here, we have the ground state. these other states would be the excited states, where the electron is excited, it releases energy, drops back, etc. Nobody is saying that between the proton here and the electron here, you need gravitons or any other stupid particles, because it's just simply a force field. It exists there. Now, if you don't need it there, why do you need it here? Because all you have are just bigger hydrogen atom, if you like, because at the center are all the protons, and at the outset are all of the electrons with the motion wave. So you don't really need it even for a hydrogen atom, because remember, this in relative to, say, a hydrogen sun or a star would be the electron rich part, and the sun is the proton rich, because this mass is much bigger. So in effect, the relationship is exactly like the hydrogen atom. So why do you need these gravitons? What's the point in that? But of course, you have to have them because quantum physicists love particles. So in essence, therefore, all bonding is relative gravity. So the difference, and this is something that I believe you should expect. I shouldn't have to say it because it should be obvious. If two atoms in relationship to one another have this electronic slope and they try to attack each other's electrons, why would bigger clusters made up of exactly the same atoms be any different in their behavior? Bricks and mortar, just bigger bricks and mortar, they're exactly the same. But there are relative gravities depending on the hunger, and I think hunger is the best thing to describe rather than charges, that the proton in one cluster has for the electrons, because it depends on how many it has in its own orbital, how hungry it becomes. So you go from smaller attractive forces of van der Waals forces, hydrogen bonding, and covalent bonding, to ionic bonding, where the cluster is super hungry, like a black hole or a star compared to a small rock or something, and it accelerates it violently and grabs its electron. So instead of actually call these bonding, it would be perfectly rational to call this van der Waals gravity, hydrogen gravity or hydrogen bonding gravity, covalent gravity and ionic gravity, because they're all the same, and that's what we should expect. So if bonding is gravity, then why does gravity not change with chemical reactions? That's a fair question. It does and it doesn't. Because if you take, for example, here a lump of wood, it has a mass, quite a considerable mass, and it sits there on the ground, and you set fire to it, and guess what happens? The great majority of it disappears into the atmosphere. Some of the ashes remain, and this energy that is released heats things up, and it does other chemical reactions within the air molecules, and then it dissipates. So what have you really done if you think about this? Although you have changed the gravity of this congregation here, you've done nothing to change the gravity of the cluster. The amount of electrons or the photons that were present here after they've been released have been absorbed in the bigger cluster, meaning planet Earth itself. So you have done nothing really to change the ratios of the two on the planet, but you have just moved them from one pocket into the other pocket. So localized changes versus cluster stability is the key point here to remember. The secret is relative ratios, not absolute numbers, because mass is not an absolute thing. It is a force. You'll see it later when we talk about Einstein and his misinterpretation of mass, but for now you should be able to see that at least the point I'm making could be valid. I'm not saying you have to agree with it for now, but just bear in mind that it makes sense that the gravity of this ensemble with the Earth changes, but ultimately it's reabsorbed elsewhere, and so it doesn't affect the Earth. Mass is relative, and it's the most misunderstood concept in physics, because that's really part of most of the problem. So mass of a congregation depends on the ratio of electrons and protons. It does not depend on the absolute number of protons. Electrons have no mass. We'll see it later. That's just an induced mass by the magnetic field, so video explaining mass later. Conclusion: gravity is the fundamental force of interaction between atoms. All bonding is gravity. The relationship between an electron and a proton in a hydrogen atom is the same as the relationship between two atoms of hydrogen in its molecule, in its molecular form, meaning electronic slope. And that relationship is the same as the relationship of you with the Earth, the Moon with the Earth, the Sun with the galaxy, and so on, which is what you should expect it to be, because the building blocks are identical. We just have bigger and bigger clusters of the same thing. that is exactly what you should expect. So all atoms are merely different spatial arrangements of hydrogen atoms. So everything in the universe is either electron rich or electron poor relative to each other, meaning depending on its mass, a bigger congregation of protons and neutrons, and remember just modified protons. So relative to each other, one thing is electron rich and the other, the bigger stuff, is proton rich or electron poor, and that's why it attacks it and it becomes its satellite. So how gravity makes all the electromagnetic spectrum from just electrons. If I have just said, and you've been following it, I'm saying that the primary reaction is this thing here. One electron, one proton, and fusion then creates. Gravity first evolves, as I've shown you, and then fusion creates other atoms. And out of this fusion, we get a whole myriad of electromagnetic events. So how are they created from just this simple thing? Again, I have to say it here, but later I'll try and give you more evidence. Electrons and photons are the same thing. The electron just trapped photons, or photons of a specific wavelength inside a magnetic field. And that's important because not every photon will be affected by a magnetic field because its wavelength is different. And that's one of the key universal laws. I don't know why it's so, but it is so, that only photons of the same or similar wavelengths or frequencies interact, the rest don't. That's why you can get some photons going through mountains and they're not absorbed. So electrons and protons are not mutually attracted. That is idiotic when you look at the evidence here. Why would it not rush in and grab the proton? Why would it be in an orbit trying to escape every time a bit of energy is added to it? Again, I will discuss this in another video in a bit more detail, but for now, that seed of doubt should be in your mind. So if you go back and follow the evolution of gravity from a gas cloud of hydrogen, two hydrogen atoms here become a hydrogen molecule, the squashing force gives rise to lattice pressure, and inside the lattice pressure, at the center here, the distance keeps getting tighter and tighter and tighter as all of the vectors constantly keep pushing everything and squashing everything together. And this is the thing that is important, that you can actually do this experiment yourself. In order for you to maintain the same velocity, c, speed of light, means increased frequency as the distance shrinks. In other words, for example, if you were running at 10 miles an hour in a field outside, but now you have to run at the same 10 miles an hour inside your bedroom, what would you have to do? Well, you'd have to run make many more trips. The frequency would have to be greatly increased between the two walls, and that is exactly what happens. The frequency of the orbital electrons increase significantly because the distance has shrunk. The idea being that gravity does not denature photons or electrons. That cannot be done. The speed of light is c, and it must be kept for whatever reason. I don't know. That's just one of the universal rules, I guess. But to do that, it will have to be traveling much more in a smaller distance in order to keep that same speed. So a key thing to remember here, which was something that I struggled at the beginning, was that I believed, say for example, a gamma ray here, where the frequency is huge, must be made up of an enormous number of electrons because it has much more energy. In other words, if you were to make a gamma ray at home from electrons, what would you have to do? Suppose you had a machine, you'd have to plug it into the electron supply, which is your main supply at home, and then you would have to just keep feeding this machine with electrons, countless, I don't know, billions of them, until eventually maybe you could manufacture a gamma ray. But here, that's not the case at all, because gravity does all the work. Gravity is squashing this thing, that one single electron, to a point where not only does it, as it created, say, a neutron in this particular case, but also it's emitting a gamma ray, a very high energy, which is only a fraction of that electron to begin with. So in other words, what gravity is really doing is, if you think about it here as a coil spring, something that you find in your car. It's not a very good drawing, I apologize, but think of it as something that's just constantly being compressed and compressed and compressed. The energy is not really put into it. There is no energy going in. It's just compression. And that is what gives it this frequency or energy when it's suddenly released. So gravity is doing all the work. It's not more energy in terms that it needs more electrons. In fact, if anything, it's less electrons because some of it has to remain in the orbit and the other one escapes. If you need a complete and systematic explanation of the point raised here, please get this book. It's free. I don't want anything from you, but it may help you because these videos are short and I can't put everything there. I have to keep putting a little bit at a time to hopefully get you to see the bigger picture as you watch them. I'm not on any social media. Don't subscribe, don't follow, I don't care. Make up your own mind. And this is the thing that's always been important to me because whoever said it, I think it was Rutherford, that there is physics and everything else is just stamp collecting. He's absolutely right. At the basis of human science, at the basis of human rational understanding, has to be the laws of physics, because if you do not build them on the laws of physics, then you build nothing. Whatever your discipline, whether it's evolution, if you do not know the quantum foundations of evolution and life, then with all due respect, you only know part of the picture. And if it's right, then it's a lucky guess. I personally also believe that one of the reasons why we don't have yet what I would call a reasonable and objective ethical and moral code is because we haven't based any of our moral codes on the laws of physics. We basically just start somewhere in the middle, do unto others as what you would do unto yourself, and all the nonsense that goes with just jumping in the middle of a story.